Hi everyone, Nicole Hanna here from Nicole Hanna Jewelry and YouTube's Go Art Yourself. Today I'm going to show a very simple technique for making a cold connection calla lily pendant. The tools and materials will be listed at the beginning and in the description below, but let's go over what I'll be using. I know it looks like a lot, but the process is actually really quick. So first I have a nice sanding block. I love these. Anytime I work with sheet metal, I have a sanding block handy. They're just disposable blocks. This is a riveting hammer. And a chasing hammer. This is a heavy chasing hammer. It's got like a 6-ounce head, and that comes in handy with the thicker gauge wires that we're going to be using. Hole punch. A file. This is part of a Nicholson file set that I just adore. It's a nice heavy-duty file, which will also come in handy with that 10-gauge wire. Some metal shears. Some wire cutters. Make sure that it can accommodate a thick gauge of wire. Some round nose pliers. Some sheet metal. This is 22 gauge sheet metal. I would suggest cutting about a 2 by 2 inch square, but the size really depends on how big you want your flower to be, honestly. A couple little rivets. These are 18 gauge, I believe. And you want your hole punch to be able to accommodate the gauge of your rivets. And this is about 20 centimeters of the 10 gauge round wire. And you're going to need a steel bench block. And what we're going to do, and the length of your 10 gauge wire really can be as long as you want it. It just depends on personal preference. So we're going to start off by hammering just about the last 2 centimeters at the end of the 10 gauge wire. I'm going to hammer it nice and flat. The heavy 6-ounce hammerhead really helps with these thicker wires. So I've got it nice and hammered flat. It needs to be able to accommodate 2 hole punches, at least, 5 millimeters apart from one another. I always give it, anytime I'm working with sheet metal or I'm hammering, I'm filing and sanding constantly because you just want those edges nice and smooth. So I'm giving it a good sanding, filing the edges, rounding it a little bit. You actually won't see it. This will be hidden inside the flower. But I think it's just good practice to get into the habit of filing things down and smoothing edges and making it look as nice as you can. So just sanding some more, file and then sand, file and sand. It's a repetitive process, but in a way it's quite enjoyable. So we've got our 2 hole punches, and now with the rest of the length of the wire, we're going to create a little spiral. This is dead soft wire with a gauge this thick. I don't recommend using anything thicker than that or anything harder. I like to keep the spiral in line with the flat hammered edge. Use your pliers when needed, when or if needed. It's kind of a small space to be working in to manipulate a wire this thick, so I'm using my pliers to help me position. And again, you'll be sanding and filing a lot to make sure that you get out any marks from the wires. So this is why length is really up to you, because you can determine how swirly and spirally you want your wire to be. So we're gonna, this large outer curve, we're gonna hammer that flat. And it's a process. You just take your time at it. You can see I'm not really lifting the hammer high. I'm not pounding hard. I'm just working at it consistently. I'm trying to tackle it from the edge to really push that metal out. And, you know, where it's most flat, you just want to give it some gentle taps on either edge of that flat area to make a nice smooth transition. And you'll notice there's sometimes some divots, and if you flip it over, it's nice and smooth. So I just constantly flip the wire over front and back, give a few taps until both sides are smooth. So I've got it nice and hammered to the width of that curve that I want it. I'm trimming off a little extra length that I don't really want on it. Now we got to follow a nice little point at the end of this wire. It's optional. You don't have to do this. You don't have to hammer it if you don't want to. If you don't have the tools, that's fine. Just leave the spiral as is, and just try to file the edge a little bit to make it smooth after trimming any extra length. I like to use metal shears to actually trim a little bit of the wire at an angle in order to get started on a point, because otherwise to file a point, I'm just going to be filing forever, and I would rather not. So I cut a little off with the metal shears and then tackle it with the file. And it seems to shorten the amount of work that I'm doing considerably when I do it that way. So I just keep going at it until it's nice and smooth. Take my sanding block again, because that file does leave a sort of texture, which we don't want. So I take my sanding block, it's a super fine sanding block, and I go back over the whole thing again, work all the way around, and then press it flat. So you've got your nice smooth flat spiral. Now you're going to cut the shape that you're going to need for the calla lily, which I equate the shape to like a guitar pick with a bit more of a point. So you're going to have a point on one end, and then it's going to be very wide with a nice flat top on the other end. Again, how big you make this is entirely up to you. As long as the shape is pretty similar, you'll have a similar result. And it's not, I'm just eyeballing it. It's you can cut a template out if you want. You can see it's not even once it looks a little lopsided, and that's, for me, that's fine. I like that, because then it results in a different looking flower each and every time. And I like to sand and file the edges, get it as smooth as possible. So you work on that for a little while, get it where you need it, run your finger along those edges and make sure there's nothing sharp. Now we need to line up those holes and create the same holes on the shape. So you can use a pen and just mark through the holes of your wire. And then you want to hole punch 2 holes in the shape that line up with the holes on the wire. And this is what you're going to be passing the rivets through. I use 2 rivets just for added security. You probably only need 1, but more is more. So I like to have 2 just for security. And you see it's nice and smooth, nice clean back. Bring it up through the surface. You see how the wire is on top of the shape, and then the rivet comes up from the bottom. You trim off any extra length of rivet that you don't need. You really only need like 2 or 3 millimeters of length. Too long and you're going to run into problems when you're hammering that rivet. So you take your riveting hammer. You can use the chasing hammer, but I find that the riveting hammer really gives you a little more control because it's a nice lightweight hammer. And you just work at it slowly to flatten the end of that rivet so that it covers the holes. And this is why you want a hole punch that punches the same size as those rivets, because if the hole is too big, you're going to run into problems again. So it creates a nice little cover around that hole, keeps it in place. I'm just going to put the second rivet in. It's a nice snug fit, which is what I like. Trimming off excess. And I'm going to hammer again. I did leave a little bit extra length on this one because the wire was a little thicker where this hole was. And I move it around as I'm hammering sometimes to make sure that that surface that I'm hammering is going to be symmetrical and round and look as good as possible, even though it is going to be hidden inside the flower. It's not a very long process. I think despite all the video cuts, this really only takes about 15 minutes or 20 minutes tops, despite the video cuts that come in and out, saving you from watching me hammer over and over again. So there we go. We've got our 2 rivets in. It's nice and secure. The back looks clean, and there's no soldering necessary. So now I take my round nose pliers and I grip that top right corner at a really extreme angle, and I start curving that in. And you want to curve it as close to the wire as you can get it. And because we used a tool to shape it, I go back with a sanding block to make sure there's no marks left on it anywhere. And then I'm just using, it's only a 22 gauge, so I'm just using my fingers to push the other side over and close that flower shape. Sometimes it's just not gonna, you're not gonna get it closed all the way, so I tend to bring the hammer back out and very gently work at it. I'm not using a lot of pressure at all when I'm hammering here, just very gently trying to close that shape as much as possible. And then always bring out that sanding block. It is my best friend when I'm working with metal. There's a little bit of space where you can see around the wire, which that'll come in handy in one of the next steps, so keep that in mind. Now you'll just need 3-4 millimeter round bead on a 2 to 3 inch head pin. The longer the head pin, the better. So I'm bringing it up through the center of the flower. And now I'm just going to wrap the end of the head pin around the 10 gauge wire at the top of the flower. You really want to make sure that this is nice and closed and there's a very tight coil so that it's very secure. So I tend to work at it a little bit with my pliers, kind of gripping it and turning as I grip to tighten that spiral a little more around the 10 gauge wire. And as usual, take my sanding block back to it and make sure there's no tool marks left behind. And I sometimes like to curve the tip of the flower. You don't have to, it's totally optional. You do want to make sure if you curve it a little bit that it's not going to poke or anything when it's being worn. So you do want to make sure that that very fine point is sanded and filed real good so that it's not sharp, it's not going to snag when it's being worn. But I just like the shape that it gives. You can also hammer the entire edge of that point to kind of curve back if you want. It's totally personal preference. It's all optional. There are no rules, I say. There are rules, but sometimes they're meant to be broken. So I always say just have fun with it. Now you just want to decide how you want it to hang. Put a little hole there for a hole punch and add a jump ring. But stay tuned because in a future video, I'm going to show you how to add a wire woven embellishment to this. So that video should be coming up in the next week. I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you have any questions, leave them in the comments below. Visit NicoleHannahJewelry.com for more tips and tutorials. Bye, everyone.